Mr. President, we thank the Somali delegation for organizing an open debate on the very sensitive and topical topic of the rule of international law in order to strengthen international peace and security. We listened carefully to Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Unfortunately, the Secretary General did not have the time, and apparently the will, to listen carefully to the members of the Council. I hope that this part of our statement will be transmitted to the Secretary General uncut. We also listened carefully to the chairperson of the African Union Commission, Mahmoud Ali Yusuf, as well as to the head of the president of the African Institute of International Law, Abdul Kowai Yusuf. Modern international law, based on the UN Charter in its entirety, is the heritage of humanity, the protection of which is one of the main tasks of our organization. And the UN Charter is not a menu from which you can choose provisions that suit our former Western partners geopolitically. It is a complete document in its entirety, totality, and interrelation. If you refer to one principle of the Charter, do not forget to quote others. The principle of sovereign equality of states, which gave a voice to all countries regardless of their size, economic and military potential. The principle of self-determination of peoples, which allowed most countries of the world to break free from colonial shackles. The principle of the prohibition of the use of force except in accordance with the UN Charter, which still prevents the global catastrophe of world war, are norms without which humanity cannot exist, at least in the form that can be called human. A world in which it is legitimate to interfere in the internal affairs of states, or to disrespect their immunity and independence, is a hunting ground for economically and technologically powerful states, and their victims must accept this reality without a murmur. Let us not forget the carefully hushed-up principle of cooperation. Ask yourself, when was the last time you heard of its existence? However, this principle is the same legal principle as the others listed above. Moreover, the International Court of Justice has rightly stated that, according to Article 1 of the Charter of the United Nations, the pillars of our organization, in addition to the maintenance of international peace and security and the implementation of international cooperation in solving international problems of an economic, social, and humanitarian nature, are the development of friendly relations among nations based on the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples. Do we remember this? The Declaration of 1970 speaks of the same thing. Who in the organization is working to implement this task? None of the reforms underway today even mention it. Mr. President, we all see what is happening in the world. Against the backdrop of the events that took place in less than a month of this year, the question is natural. Is international law an empty phrase? Maybe it is worth declaring it dead and going to the beautiful world of the rule of force. It is important to recall here how modern international law was created. It was not the product of armchair professors or romantic dreamers. The UN Charter and the corpus of fundamental multilateral conventions were written by people who went through the crucible of World War II, who saw with their own eyes what a world looks like, in which compliance with treaties began to be considered a stupid formality, in which one state proclaimed itself to represent an exclusive race with a right to the resources of its near and distant neighbors, where the population living in these territories was to be exterminated or simply starved to death. It was these people who won an armed victory over the terrible ideology of fascism, Nazism, and militarism, who formulated the above-mentioned principles and created the organization that should protect them. It was those who managed to win the armed and economic struggle against evil, who decided that military and economic power should not rule the world. It was they who put cooperation in the first place, not confrontation, although at that time they were separated by serious ideological barriers. It was they who wrote in the UN Charter that we, the peoples of the United Nations, are determined to create conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be observed. Mr. President, not all the tasks assigned to the organization have been fulfilled. For a while, it seemed that ideological confrontation stood in the way of their implementation. However, when it stopped, and it seemed that an era of peace, economic cooperation, and prosperity should have begun, something went wrong. We have been told, and continue to be told, that the principle of cooperation and the establishment of good neighborly relations exists only for the chosen or appointed, and that economic warfare, called sanctions for euphony, is a legitimate instrument and norm of international law, and that cooperation in the field of technology should be organized in such a way as to perpetuate the technological lag of developing countries. That the expansion and rearmament of the NATO military bloc, which was marked by a whole series of illegal military actions from Yugoslavia to Libya, is a measure that contributes to peace and security, and the country against which this bloc was created should calmly look at the advance of high-tech military infrastructure to its borders. Back in 2007 in Munich, the president of Russia directly posed the question, against whom is this expansion? And what happened to the assurances given by Western partners after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact? Where are these statements now? Nobody even remembers them. Mr. President, the ideologists of this aggressive approach were confident, and even openly stated that Russia would remain silent, even if such an expansion was carried out in violation of existing international legal obligations, as was the case with Ukraine, which undertook not to take part in military blocs in its declaration of state sovereignty, and then in the Treaty of Friendship with Russia, pledged not to allow that its territory be used to the detriment of Russia's security. Russia had to remain silent, even when, in order to accelerate the implementation of plans to turn the country into an anti-Russia in Ukraine, a Western-sponsored coup d'etat was staged with the participation of neo-Nazi groups, and the government that came to power in fact became an avatar of NATO forces, unleashed a war with the Russian population of Donbass, and does not want to end it to this day. Thus, a unique chance to develop genuine cooperation for the benefit of all, not some, was missed, and the world slipped into confrontation. As President Putin said in his speech back in 2007, in international affairs, there is an increasing desire to resolve this or that issue on the basis of so-called political expediency. And this, of course, is extremely dangerous. And it leads to the fact that no one feels safe anymore, because no one can hide behind international law like behind a stone wall. This is what some of our European partners have now felt the hard way. This is how their so-called rules-based order works, which they themselves promoted and have now fallen victim to. Revolution, as you know, devours its own children. Mr. President, let's ask ourselves a question. Was this choice rational even for those who chose confrontation? We are convinced that it was not. The world is falling into the abyss of a geopolitical economic crisis, from which the population of those countries that relied on domination through force is also suffering. We are convinced that the way out of this multifactorial crisis does not lie, as the elites of these countries believe, through the construction of a blooming garden, behind the barbed fence of which the majority of humanity suffers. We must not allow the worst predictions of science fiction writers to come true, in which people are divided into privileged centenarians and suffering short-livers who ensure the well-being of the former. Therefore, restoring respect for international law is not a speculative task, but the only way to save humanity. If we miss this chance, there may not be another one. Mr. President, we are convinced that no sane person would want to live in a world where, for example, the international law of the sea does not work, where freedom of navigation on the high seas can be jeopardized by military actions based on the domestic legislation of individual states, where, contrary to international air law, civilian aircraft do not fly and national prohibitive measures are imposed, where the immune-protected sovereign assets of the state, the money earned by an entire nation, can be stolen by a handful of greedy globalist elites who have been robbing humanity for years with the help of fraudulent financial institutions. We are not even talking about the forcible abduction of the head of an independent state on the basis of an arrest warrant issued by the district city court of a particular country. A world that lives by such rules can hardly last long, and if it can, it is unlikely to be a human world, rather a picture from a dystopia. Mr. President, we must all fight for international law. Everyone's voice is important here. The struggle for international law is a struggle for the normal meaning of words, where violation is called violation. We know that for many countries, telling the truth is a courageous step, which is often fraught with threats and coercion. But standing up for the truth is never easy. The most important role in this fight belongs to the UN. Now, we must admit, the organization is not up to the task. To rectify the situation, it must regain its independence and not play on the side of the powerful and rich, as it is currently doing. That is a difficult task, but we must succeed. Otherwise, the organization will lose its role and relevance, with catastrophic consequences for the entire world. Thank you.